Joining us today, however, is Clark Dever, who you probably know if you've joined past webinars. He's a seasoned executive with over 20 years of experience in product development and operations management.
I want to start off with the caveat. As a reminder, always think about what information you're plugging into an LLM because there is no cloud. There is just someone else's computer. So set your options to not allow your data to be used in training, but realize that your second brain is hosted on someone else's server. Uh, so today we're going to talk a little bit about teaching structured prompt design. The goal is to make your prompts role-driven, reusable, scalable, so that you can build them into software if you want to. And we're going to focus on some real-world workflows, right? We're trying to make this tactical in our approach. So, from an agenda standpoint, we're going to talk about the fundamentals. We're going to emphasize the power of context, show how I think about chaining tools together to get the best output. And then a brief little overview of the current state of LLMs. I had to change the slide last week when the new version of Claude came out. So this stuff's moving fast and is heavily subjective. But I wanted to give you at least my current take. And then we'll work on real prompt examples that you can use inside the enterprise in different roles. And hopefully they'll help you generate some good questions and ideas. And we can have an active QA session as we wrap up the discussion. So let's start with the anatomy of a prompt. So each part adds clarity and control. You should think of prompts as modular and not magic. And what you're really trying to do is help the model think like you in a way. And we're going to go through each one of these components step by step. So role is, what you're telling the prompt to act like. The way that I usually prompt it, I either say you are A or I say act as A, and then I give it a job title most of the time. What this does is it sets the domain expertise, and in the background, when it's thinking, it's going to use domain relevant vocabulary and knowledge. And it allows you to treat the LLM like a specialist actor. Once you've defined the role, the next step is to build the actual prompt. Now, the way to think of that is like, what's the task that you want to complete? And when you're dealing with LLMs, they are genius level interns, is what I usually describe them with. So imagine someone who has a PhD, but doesn't have any real world experience. And so you have to give them very clear expectations. And that's what a lot of this prompt design is. So for the prompt, I focus on giving very clear directives, not vague considerations, unless it's a brainstorming session and I'm trying to suss things out. But in general, even then, I want to ask targeted questions and tell it to give me a breadth of response. You should use action verbs with clear targets, and think of the prompt as the task instruction. So one final trick that I always try and use in my prompt is if it's a large scale effort or something that I'm doing, I tell the model to ask clarifying questions before responding. So I'll say, do not write any code if we're doing code, or do not start writing the final output until you've asked clarifying questions and I've responded. Sometimes it doesn't work with the thinking models as well because they're set up to use this agentic format where they come up with a plan. But if you're talking with any of the kind of non-thinking or lesser models, they're very good at respecting that command. And so it allows you to add more context because what you'll quickly realize is how much assumed knowledge you use as a human. And it really helps over time to get you better at fully delineating all of the steps you need, all of the things that you want to achieve. Because if you don't outline it, then the LLM is just going to make assumptions and you're going to have it's going to take you longer or it's not going to be as consistent again if you're trying to put it into software. So really good prompts try and remove as much ambiguity as possible. So the constraints portion, and I forgot to mention it, but the reason it's hashtag constraints is because the prompts are very good at understanding JSON and very good, or not the prompts, the LLMs are good at understanding JSON and very good at understanding Markdown because they've read a lot of it. And so you can delineate portions of your prompt with the pound sign is basically the header tag in Markdown. So we're saying this is a H1, and anything that comes between this and the next header is relative to the current header. And so I actually use that to break up my prompts, and we'll see that later, to just provide more clarity to the LLM as to like what we're saying, what we're asking. So the constraints portion of your prompt is really where you tell it, maybe the style and structure, set some limits. I want it to be 400 words. Prompts think in tokens, but you can use words and they'll proxy pretty well. Also providing guardrails around like keeping the output useful. The constraints could be respond in JSON, right? And then you're guaranteed to get back most of the time a JSON object that is valid. You could also, some of the models, if you're interacting through an API with them, there's a parameter that you can set so that it'll only respond in JSON. And so that eliminates all of the fluff that sometimes you get before and after that would break your JSON object. The other thing about constraints is it prevents overgeneration and what I call drift, away from your topic. You'll see this, I think, especially in the thinking models. They get real ambitious and they'll start talking about adjacent things that they just are running off on. And so by setting a good scope for it, it helps give you the targeted output you need. And the constraints could be as simple as like, this is an email, keep it email length. Yeah. So let's move on to tone. So tone is where you're giving the LLM an understanding of, kind of how you want to match the audience mood, right? Is this a formal presentation for an executive? Is this social media content? Is this a letter to a friend? You can talk about formal, informal. One of the tricks I like to use is say in the style of, and you can pick your favorite author, and it does well. I've also, said using the guidelines from the elements of style, because generally the LLMs have been trained on all of the books, and so you can reference the books as contextual references, and it'll apply its knowledge of those books to whatever it's writing. I think it's really important in public and branded work to set the tone, so you can actually develop a brand voice if you don't already have one. You could actually, if you have one, but it's not well documented, you can take your blog post, your social post, whatever, get 50 of them or 10 of them, feed it in to the LLM and ask it to describe in great detail what is your brand voice and export that as a JSON file. And then you can use that description, that JSON description, as a tone constraint in your future content. And so that allows you to maintain consistency across your postings on different platforms based on your previous work. And so building from reference like that is a great way to, again, develop a very consistent voice. And maybe you're just starting something from scratch, so you can go find posts that you like, or you can do some search to see what are the highly converting posts and formats right now, and then scrape a bunch of those, feed them to the LLM, have it analyze them, and then use that as your prompt or a constraint. So context is probably the most important component of this besides the actual prompt. The prompt section is where you're defining your task, so obviously that's very important, but context in the new models with these large context windows really drives the success of your prompting. And so we'll talk a bit in future slides about how do we build a great context for our prompt. But you can think of context as giving the model a map, providing it information about past decisions maybe you've already made, what your goals are in the future, what are some of the stakeholders and what are their thoughts on this process. You can either upload files directly, or if you have a more advanced system or you're using, say, custom GPTs on OpenAI, you can load your documents into the custom GPT, and that's simulating or using what's called retrieval augmented generation. And so it's going to do keyword searches and then take subsets of the relevant text and put them into the context window and use that as part of the response. So the context now is on the latest models is over 1 million tokens. If you're using, I think, Claude 4 or Gemini 2.5. And so you can put entire books into context and use them for reference. So, curating the information that you're giving the LLM before you prompt it is really going to dictate the success of your results. So let's talk about, how do we really hone in on getting the exact inputs and outputs we want. And so there's a couple different styles of prompting. So there's zero shot, and that's what most people do is they just give the prompt and they get what they get. And then there's this one shot and few shot prompting style where it takes more effort to put together, like, this is what my input is going to look like. And usually we do this in software system designs, but I've used it in documentation as well, where you say, given this input, we want this output, and you show an example input and you show an example output. And generally that's enough. One shot prompts provide a lot of value with the current models. If there's nuance and some details that it's getting wrong when you're trying to get ready for production, you might benefit from using a multi-shot or a few shot prompt where you give it multiple inputs that have like whatever that little nuance or variability is, and then show the outputs and how it should be impacting the outputs. And that will generally solidify kind of the expected output format. I'll show you in a prompt later that we use for, or I use for creating Jira tickets. I have a very specific input and output expectation, and I'm using a custom GPT to build those. Let's see. I think the other thing is you can tell in your example output, you can show it files or tables or snippets, and it'll emulate that style on the output. And so that's really handy for generating visuals from content, from freeform content that can be inserted into your documents. One last trick with example inputs is you can create what we would call synthetic inputs by using another prompt, another LLM, or it could be the same LLM in a different window to generate, what an expected input might look like and what an expected output should look like, and then use those to reference in the final prompt. So when in doubt, use an LLM. From the opposite of the input obviously is the output. Just a few notes, it's like you're giving it a target format. The goal is to reduce ambiguity and improve reuse. One thing that I've noticed in a production system we built is that if you have base data and it's a large amount of base data contextually, and you need to know something specific about a lot of those variables, the models do better if you ask one question at a time instead of saying, hey, fill out this entire output based on this input. So if you're working with a conversational model that has that state storage, you can do that, or you can just keep reprompting it with the input and asking the individual question, and then collect all of the answers and reformat your desired output at the end. It has to do with focus. And some of this is solved in the thinking models, but the thinking models are more expensive. So you can use smaller, cheaper models if you work iteratively on like the problem statement sometimes. Let's see. Also, you can use another LLM to help you build a schema or define a schema. Oftentimes when I'm doing software development, I'm not a database administrator by trade. And so I will ask, what other fields should I consider putting in this table based on what you know about the architecture? And so it'll remind me about all these metadata tables that or metadata data columns that I always forget to put in there, like when it was created, when it was last updated, who was the last person to touch it, or whatever. So there's good ways. I personally believe that you should treat the LLM during the design process as, kind of like the peer programmer who you're talking through the concepts with. And a lot of times it comes up with bad ideas, and that's where your human knowledge and wisdom come into play, and you can just edit those out. But the breadth first approach to idea generation, they are very, very good at generating a broad range of ideas quickly, and so you should utilize that capability. And it's much easier to curate down in my experience. All right. So let's talk a little bit about tool chaining. So this is how, if you were, to focus in on the folks in our community, if you're a data scientist competing in a challenge, or maybe you're a geoscientist who's done some interpretation, this is a great way to get uh, documentation built for you. And so I'll talk through it. So as you're doing the work, or when you're working with a peer, you take notes as you go. So you capture, the meeting agendas, outlines. Maybe you work together to build an outline of like what you want to cover in your final document. Uh, and then, again, you can have this feedback process where you take those inputs, you give it to an LLM, and you say, hey, this is our desired output. Can you help us build an outline using this? You could take that outline, feed it to another LLM like Perplexity, or use OpenAI or Gemini's deep research features. And you can say, hey, go learn everything you can about the things in this outline. And that helps you build context. Again, you take that output, you read through it as a human, you curate it, you make sure that it's factually correct and not hallucinated or not scraped from, irreparable or websites with poor reputations. Um, you can also tell Perplexity or uh, OpenAI or Google's engines to like use high trust websites like government and academic websites in the search and avoid blogs, and it'll do a pretty good job of that when it's sourcing. But once you have all that, then I take the outline and I hit record on the notes feature in my phone, or I'll go into one of the models that has voice transcription and I'll hit record and I will talk through my outline to get the transcription and provide all the color commentary and background and my thoughts, opinions, the way I speak. It's documenting all of that. And that narrative capture really helps make the output sound a lot more like you and have your actual thoughts in it, as opposed to just being generic output from like whatever best practices and research you put in. So it's a way to really share your wisdom. And so we provide all of that context that we've generated, the relevant deep research part, the outline that we want for the final document, and our narrative transcription reading through that outline and providing all the color and our wisdom into the final prompt. And that is how you're able to get really great document creation very quickly. You could spend 30 minutes or an hour doing all of this prep work, but it'll save you 5 hours of writing and rewriting and drafting, and you'll get to the 80 or 90% solution out of the gate, and then you can just go in and tweak it yourself with a final review and like maybe edit with your team. But that's this tool chaining using different LLMs to accomplish different outputs and then collecting them all for your final prompt is kind of the best practice at this point if you're trying to create any kind of large document or even starting a coding project. I do the same thing as a product manager when I'm starting to vibe code something. I'll spend a couple hours doing the product requirement document and the architecture document with the LLM so that I can feed it to the agent before I start beginning writing code. So I've kind of been hammering on this, but context is king. The prompts alone, I say, are like half the equation at this point. And you should really think of search and deep research tools that the LLMs can use as your prompt before the prompt. What do we need to know in order to have a very informed LLM going into our final generation? Multimodal data, so that means images, video, audio recordings. At this point, PDFs, most of the main tools, the main models are all multimodal. And so you can give it whatever context you have, and that will inform it. So if I'm building a ticket generator as a product manager, I can feed it in images that my design team has built. Or if I don't have a design team, because I'm an individual contributor, I can use one of the design tools, that have been released recently by Figma, or Google has one. And I can say, hey, provide me a user experience, for this feature. And then I can play with that until I get what I want, and then use that to help write my tickets and inform my team for final development. I think currently the highest bandwidth communication for most of the models is you speak and it responds in the written word. I think that's just the highest bandwidth because the voice generation on some of them still takes longer and it's easier to just get the text input and you can read faster than you can listen. So a tool for that, there's one called Whisper Flow, and then obviously most of the operating systems have a speech to text function, and many of the models on the websites have a speech to text function. So I encourage you experimenting with that. From a tool selection standpoint, um, it's about picking the best model for the task. It's changing and evolving all the time. I would say that there's always trade-offs between, depth of response, cost, accuracy, speed. So I think you can, this chart was my attempt and it's very subjective, but to give you an idea of what models I think to use first when I'm trying to attempt these different tasks. GPT 4.0 is incredible for image creation and image modification. Gemini 2.5, you have to use it in the AI studio, but their image manipulation is very, very good as well. Those are kind of my two go-tos. Um, for coding, I've heard great things about the new version of Claude. Gemini 2.5 is incredible, although somewhat ambitious, right? Putting constraints on all of those things as to what they're allowed to do and touch is very important. Um, and then, I think that Claude traditionally, like 2.7, has been great for written English. So if you need help with your documentation, maybe your English second language, it's a great way to translate from your native tongue into English, and also to just create great documentation for the code you've written. So let's walk through a couple real world examples. So I use this all the time. This is my executive communication. Whenever I'm writing to leadership in the organization or I'm putting together a memo for my team, it really helps me clarify my thinking and write in a polished tone that is very high signal to noise. Um, so I work in that same tool flow that I talked about before, where I'll draft notes, I'll record audio, I'll give it bullets about what I want to say. And then I use a prompt like this. You can see I have all of the different sections broken out by header that we talked about. And each one of them is really there to kind of focus us in on the desired output. I think one thing to realize is that these are just a starting place, right? I'm just trying to give you examples that you can work off of to move forward. But give something like this a try if you haven't. It's a great way to get a very polished output on what might be messier thoughts. From the next one, we'll talk about, steel manning the counter argument. If you really want to improve your thinking on a subject, LLMs are a great way to get the opposite viewpoint. And I think as a human right now, we're in a very polarized space. And so trying to understand maybe what the other side is thinking in a way that isn't emotionally triggering or whatever because of the nature that you're basically getting upset at a computer at that point might be good for everyone. So this is a great prompt for trying to understand maybe and strengthen your strategy by challenging it, and building empathy for the opposing view. Uh, and I always think it's the job of every good leader to sit at the top of the table and imagine themselves in every seat at the table. So if you're an executive, maybe you want to understand what your counterparty thinks about this deal and help you structure the incentives in a better way. So this is a great use case for this prompt. So we're all kind of in charge of our own brands on some level, but you also don't want to sound like a an LLM. You don't want the M dash giving you away. So here's a prompt that helps you look for opportunities in your domain and then uses RAG or search or Gen AI to put it together and give you some blog posts. And again, I think the important thing to remember is with each of these, you're getting the 80 or 90% solution. And then you should always go back in and do your editorial process to take it the final 10% to really make it yours. Uh, but what we're seeing right now is there's a lot of automation tools like N8N that are being used for discovery, curation, trend analysis. You know, the term that you can go look up is vibe marketing. But it allows you to target underserved keywords or things that you might be able to compete on and create structured outputs for like a blog workflow, for instance. But this could also be used for your social media, and then you can schedule it. Uh, One little trick that I would give you if you have the technical capability, there's kind of two ways to approach it. But one is you can take your writings, again, go to an LLM and ask it to describe it in JSON and then provide that as the tone part of this prompt. Or if you're a little bit more technically inclined, you OpenAI for sure, and then other companies probably as well have the ability to fine tune a model to your writing. So you could take whatever, you know, your top 100 performing Twitter posts of all time, put them together in a file, upload that file through the API to OpenAI, and it will fine tune a tweet like Clark model that you can then use through an API request, and it'll write in a similar style to you. Could also be, you know, your technical writing or whatever, but you can build a custom model that will use uh, your cadence and word choice and that sort of thing. And so very cool feature worth exploring. So this is the one, you know, I provided it in prompt form, but in reality, I use this as a custom GPT that I built using OpenAI. The example input and output of my model are a little bit more complex than this, but I tell it to write all my user stories in a specific format and write all my acceptance criteria in kind of the opposite format of that. Like there's a standard one. Um, but it allows you to quickly convert raw ideas into spec. And, you know, personally, like I am inconsistent if I'm writing tickets. And so by giving it a solid example output, you're able to get very consistent, high quality tickets. And it's up to you to make sure that they actually represent your ideas faithfully. One thing in this, you know, variant of the prompt, I say include only 2 to 3 edge cases. I actually tend to go the other way. I think one of the things that is important to realize about prompting at this point is generation is really cheap. And so I'll say like generate 10 edge cases and then I'll review them and I'll delete down to 2 or 3 that I think actually matter because a lot of them won't. Um, and so oftentimes when I'm trying to name something or come up with an idea, I will for brainstorming purposes, I'm continually asking the model to come up with 20 ideas and then using my ability as a human to curate down. And I'll be like, oh, I like these 3, iterate on these 3, and it'll come, you know, give me 20 new ideas based on these 3. And that's how I'll work my way till to a solution, you know, in the design space and the problem space. I just think it's a fast way to improve engineering clarity. It's also great for reporting bugs because you can give a if you're using a tool like Loom specifically, you can record your session, replicate the bug, and then have Loom write the ticket. And so again, these are multimodal. You might not have to use Loom. You maybe, you know, whatever your company allows you to use, but you can do a screen capture and then feed the screen capture to a multimodal uh, model and get a very congruent ticket out if you've developed a prompt for, you know, what your bug reporting looks like inside your company. Sales prompt, again, context is king, and these deep research tools make it very easy to target specific companies, specific individuals. We were playing with an experiment internally a while ago, and we were looking at another company. We asked the LLMs based on deep research to identify their strategy. And then we had a meeting with them and they told us their strategy and it aligned with what the LLM had said. And it wasn't explicitly stated anywhere in the documents, but just through the data exhaust that people have from posting on social media and whatever, the LLM was able to determine with a high degree of accuracy what that strategy was. So very interesting capabilities. Also, should remind you to remind your team about operational security and whatever you're doing, right? Like, be careful what you post. I think it gathers intel fast for outreach. It allows you to generate custom messaging based on the role or the use case. Again, if you combine this with your predefined marketing message and a custom model that you've fine-tuned, you can create very direct and high converting automations. And I think humans are always on broadcast, and so if you're able to quickly identify their social media presence and ingest a lot of it, into the LLM using these tools, you'll have a very good understanding of your subject before you even have the call. So this is the last prompt I'm going to go over, and this is actually kind of funny. So the initial internal version of this presentation that we gave at Think Onward had very cute kawaii style images, and this was the image prompt that I built to generate all the images to have consistency across the presentation. When we decided to make it a public-facing webinar, I changed it to be more aligned with kind of our brand guidelines, but I didn't. The LLM was basing the images on the content of the slides, and so since the content of the slide is the old prompt, we have kind of the mix mash of the kawaii style and the more brand safe version that we use throughout this presentation. I think the important thing to take away here is that the JSON makes it reproducible, right? So again, you can feed a bunch of images you like to an LLM, ask the LLM to describe it as a JSON object, and then use that as a constraint in future prompting. It allows you to templatize your visual identity, and you can give it specific colors, a brand safe color palette. We talked a little bit about you can also use it to document writing styles or common writing outputs. So maybe it's not your voice, but you can say, okay, here's 10 highly performing listicles, analyze this, write it down as a formula in JSON so that another LLM could write to this format, and then feed that format as a constraint, and now you'll get the type of listicle you want for your blog. So I think that's it at this point. I would love to open it up for questions.
There are a couple of questions that we have that I will see if we can stump you with. All right. So speaking of stumping, where do you see most people getting tripped up when they're trying to use AI at work?
Well, one, probably internal policies. A lot of companies are still very hesitant around AI, and that's why I started the briefing with like, hey, be careful with your proprietary information. You don't want it to be a result in the future for some AI company. But two, I think that folks limit themselves. My experience at this point with AI is I have bias from my career, right? For 20 years, I've done things and I know certain things are hard to do and certain things are easy to do. And I will believe that the AI will be able to solve this because this is a hard problem. That's giving yourself a lot more credit than you probably deserve, or at least giving myself a lot more credit than I deserve. Um, and so I think that the self-limiting that people tend to do actually limits your success using these AI tools. And so what I encourage people to do is if you're not confident or you worry, maybe, hey, maybe I can't do this, or just like try it. And if you're really unsure, just ask the AI how the AI would do it, right? Like, how would you prompt this? And it'll write you a prompt, and that's an example of meta prompting. What other things could I add to make this stronger? Or I wrote this document, can give me an editorial review. Those just starting with simple things. And what I often tell folks is people think of, automating their workflow as like, I'm not going to do these big projects or whatever, but really the easiest stuff to automate is the tasks that you spend 5 minutes on 10 or 20 times a day that you have to now deal with the context switching and all of this. And so if you can look through what you're spending your time on and build prompts that allow you to do that in 20 seconds instead of 5 minutes and just crunch through it all at once, now you're freeing up hours every week, and that's going to give you the capability to take on larger and larger automation problems or prompt problems.
All right, awesome. Are there things that you wouldn't recommend using AI for, or that you personally wouldn't use them for?
Again, it comes down to some sensitive information. I definitely, if I didn't have the legal rights to the information that I was feeding into it, that would be something I wouldn't use it for. Uh, Depending on your personal computing situation, there are models you can run locally that are safe. A lot of the law firms are paying for that right now to build like their own internal GPT-4, so that they can accelerate their work while maintaining confidentiality. I mean, the truth is that they are very expert at a lot of things, and I use it to validate, different people's opinions all the time. And so beyond the concern for, my personal data exhaust and what data I'm giving, OpenAI or whoever through interacting with the model, there's very few things that I am, afraid to like at least try. I think it the important thing is just protecting that information security as much as possible, and that includes your own personal stuff. I mean, anytime you talk to it, it's learning about you. I mean, there's some interesting prompts out there. Again, if you've been a Chat GPT user for a while, or any of the models that have history and memory. And I think some of them have been it's undocumented, because like it behooves the different companies to make their models feel like their responses are better, right? And so they're always, I know, again, OpenAI is transparent about the memories, but I think there's even another level where they're looking at like historically, like what indicators have you given us? Probably your job title, where you're from, et cetera. Over time, that stuff aggregates. If you make hundreds and hundreds of queries, it pulls out nouns and verbs, throws them in a box, and then it can always read it. And so that data exhaust builds up, and I think that's something that a lot of people who haven't worked in an information security environment don't really think about as much. And so giving yourself operational security rules about what you're willing to tell the model is probably uh, the context that I give. And it's not that I won't do stuff, but I'm very careful as to how I talk to the model.
We do have a few more for you here, Clark. Next one is, who do you follow to keep up with the latest developments in AI?
That's a good question. I think that I find that the highest signal to noise ratio is on X. And so a lot of the folks that I follow is on there. And I'll also like follow groups. There's a vibe coding group, there's a vibe marketing group, there's AI video. I've basically, between YouTube and X, I've trained the algorithms to feed me all the relevant AI stuff to the point where there's days I just check out, right? Like when Google I/O happened, I'm like, I can't even watch this because it's just going to be the hype machine for the rest of the day. Um, but it is a good way to see what's being developed. And I think obviously the big frontier models are exciting and they unlock new capabilities that weren't previously available. But if you tune into, like, per se, like the vibe coding community, people are always publishing what they're building, and that is really motivating, right? And the vibe marketing, again, how are people using these tools to analyze their positioning of their company relative to everyone else, and then figuring out a niche and then marketing to that niche using these tools as well. I mean, it is uh, a an curious individual, and an army of LLMs is more powerful than most entire marketing teams, in my experience.
What, with so many new things kind of coming out all the time, what is the filter that you use to decide what is and what is not worth your time to learn?
I try not to focus on keeping up with it. Like I try and focus on doing things like actions, right? Because there's always a new model, there's always a new tool, and you can spend a lot of time testing things and not actually generating value, right? Like you're just experimenting with the tools. And I think that's the chasing butterflies effect. Like I would much rather have um, last week's hammer and be hitting a nail than waiting for the next tool to drop. And so there's everyone finds their spot on the adoption curve. I would definitely say I'm an early adopter, but I try and be as late of an early adopter as possible because truthfully, specializing in any of the tools at this point is almost kind of moot because the next released from an opposing company is going to dethrone that tool, and you're just behind. So it's like pick the ones you like, pick the companies you like. I really like Anthropic's viewpoint on how they come at AI more than I like OpenAI's viewpoint on how they come at AI. So I try and spend my dollars with the companies that I think are doing the ethical work as much as possible. Um, yeah, I don't know. I feel like that was a meandering answer, but that's that's how I think about it. It's just like go build things. Don't fondle the hammer, hit the nail.
Awesome. Awesome. Last question here that we've got. You kind of mentioned earlier in this session, giving context so it can better represent and kind of speak in your own voice. So can you share more details about how you do that effectively? For example, are you uploading a handful of documents in each new chat thread, or do you give it context some other way?
So I think there's, depending on the tool set you use, there's different options, right? So if you're, you know, uh, in the OpenAI ecosystem, right, you can create projects. I think Claude has a similar capability as well. And those are the retrieval augmented generation, right? So if you're doing your job function a lot and you want to provide the LLM the resources that you trust or the documents relevant, again, to if you own the IP rights to them to your business, not the company that employs you, you can stick those in the folder and then it'll be referenced by search as part of the context. If it's a one-off or one-shot question, oftentimes I'm curating 4, 5, 6 documents and then I'm uploading it with that specific prompt into the tool that I'm using. And then again, it may be images, it may be video, it may be a transcription, or maybe an actual voice recording from me. Or it could be the search results. So oftentimes I'll go to Perplexity, I'll have it do some research. I'll go to Grok, I'll have it do research. Perplexity is, I would say, Perplexity Pro and their deep research is very good and is able to get contemporary like web sources. Grok is really great because it has full access to X and the Twitter stream. And so there's, current opinions, context, like all these things, like every social media has like its own slight bias, but for purely just like up to date technical input, great resource to get up to the minute, like what people are thinking on a subject. So I'll use these different search tools. I'll save them as markdown files, and then I'll upload the markdown file as part of my context for whatever prompt I'm getting.
All right, that's great. Well, looks like we're out of questions, Clark. I want to thank you so much for your time and all this valuable information. Thank you for joining, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your attendance.